And I'd like to welcome Dr. Steve Lockie to the stage. Steve is a postdoctoral research fellow in organisational trust here with us at the University of Queensland Business School. His research focuses on trust violation and repair, as well as, of course, trust in AI technologies and ethical leadership and decision making. So thank you, Steve, for taking us through this next Research Insight session.
Thanks, Nicole. And as the presenters and the discussant join us on stage, I'd first like to just start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Now, as David, in his fantastic keynote, has intimated, organizations are increasingly turning to, or at least thinking about turning to, emerging technologies and data-led operational approaches to realize benefits such as increased productivity and efficiency, and to attempt to deliver better outcomes for customers and for employees. But there, as David also intimated, there are lots of risks associated with emerging tech, including issues around privacy, bias, inexplicability, etc., that are far beyond the scale and scope of what traditional technologies were even capable of. So in this Research Insight session, we have 3 presentations from UQ experts actively working in emerging tech, who will present to us what they've been working on, and importantly, they'll provide some practical advice for organizations on how to leverage the benefits of emerging technology and data-led approaches, while also trying to help us mitigate some of the risks associated with them. Our first presentation will come from Dr. Caitlin Curtis. Caitlin is a research fellow in the UQ Centre for Policy Futures and also a lecturer at UQ Business School. And her presentation draws on some of the survey findings that Nicole had mentioned earlier from 5 countries relating to public trust in artificial intelligence, and really urges organizations to be proactive in the development and deployment of AI in order to meet the heavy public expectations of AI trustworthiness. The second presentation will be from Dr. Tapani Rinta-Kahila, who is a lecturer in information systems at UQ. And Tapani will present his analysis of the robo-debt case and what we can learn from it in relation to the use of automated decision-making systems that can have really strong societal impact. And last but by no means least, we have a presentation from Associate Professor Martin Edwards. Martin is Associate Professor in Management, and his presentation examines employee perceptions of predictive monitoring and metric HR tools. And Martin will speak to the care that organizations need to take in the implementation of such tools. And finally, I'm really delighted to welcome our discussant, Dr. Rob Mullins, who is a senior lecturer in the T.C. Burns School of Law. Rob has an interest in models of legal reasoning developed in artificial intelligence and law. And Rob will synthesize the insights from the 3 presentations before we open the floor to questions. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Caitlin Curtis.
I would also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we are, the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize 60,000 years of connection to country. There we go. Hi, my name is Caitlin, and I'm really happy to be here and be part of this great conversation that we're having, and hi to everyone who's joining online. And today I'm going to talk about some of our work on AI and trust, and I'd like to talk about this idea that there are a suite of risk conditions that are associated with AI systems, and thinking about these risk conditions can help us to identify ways for organizations to be proactive in the way that they create and deploy AI systems that are trustworthy. And this work has been done in collaboration with Nicole Gillespie and Steve Luckey, who are right here with us, and it's been a pleasure to work in Nicole's group. So I'll get started. Whether we know it or not, we are likely to interact with AI in some form every day because these systems are increasingly ubiquitous, and they're being incorporated into many things from social media. We have our virtual assistants. And these systems have a lot of potential to address global challenges. So these can be things like improved medical diagnosis, precision agriculture, or even better weather predictions. And of course, there are efficiency gains that businesses can get from these systems as well. But as we've talked about, we know that there is a risk of harm from these systems. So this can be real or perceived harm to society. And when things do go wrong, there can be reputational risk to the organizations that have created and deployed these systems. And so the metaphor of the perfect storm has been used to describe a combination of events that can create an unusually bad situation. So, for example, in the lead up to the global financial crisis, it's been argued that there were a combination of factors: interconnectivity, leverage, underestimation of risk, and these things all combined to create this perfect financial storm. In a similar way, we might suggest that there may be a perfect storm of conditions related to AI systems that can heighten their risk of harm to society. So in this talk, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what are these conditions and what can we do to minimize and mitigate these risks. And the first condition that I wanted to talk about is the powerful and invisible nature of AI systems. And we know that the black box nature of AI systems can make it difficult for people and organizations to know how decisions are being made about them. And this can mean that issues like bias and discrimination might not be immediately apparent or obvious, and the people that may be negatively impacted when this happens may come disproportionately from vulnerable groups, and they might be people with the least power and agency. And we know that people have concerns about these potential society risks that may be being posed by AI systems. So as we've talked about, last year we deployed a survey with KPMG of over 6,000 people in 5 Western countries. And that was focused on public trust and attitudes toward AI. And more than half of those people viewed 4 key challenges as being likely to impact large numbers of people in the next 10 years. So these were things like surveillance, cyber attack, fake online content, and the privacy of our data. The second risk condition that I want to talk about is the low public awareness and understanding about AI systems. And this can raise issues about informed consent, and it can also impact people's ability or the public's ability for meaningful public engagement and debate and consultation about these systems that are being deployed. And it can also mean that issues can go unchecked and unchallenged because maybe people aren't even aware that these systems are operating behind the scenes. Or they may not be aware whether there's a human or an automated system that's responsible for making decisions. So our survey revealed that there's a relatively low understanding and awareness about AI. So around 60% of people, you can see here in green, that's about 3 in 5 people, felt that they had little understanding about AI or when and how it's being used. And we also asked people about their use of a range of technologies. So these were ranging from traffic navigation apps to accommodation sharing apps. And we also asked them whether or not they thought that these technologies used AI. And here you can see the gray bars showing the percentage of people that were reporting using these various types of AI-enabled technologies. And the red bars are showing the percentage of people who reported being aware that these technologies use AI. So in cases where we have the gray bar exceeding that red bar of awareness, then we seem to have a gap between the use of AI and people's awareness that AI is being used. So although in many instances we have large numbers of people who are using these systems, many of these same people were not aware that the technology that they were interacting with contained AI. And the gap between this use and awareness was especially pronounced for social media and email filters. So again, even with those everyday common applications that we're all used to using, like email filters or Google Maps, there's still a relatively low awareness about when, where, and how AI systems are being used. And as you can see on the right, although it's very tiny, in blue, these trends were roughly similar across the 5 countries that we surveyed. The next condition is the rapid investment and deployment of AI systems that can increase the scale of risk of harm to society as they're rolled out at scale. And I'm not going to talk about this one in too much detail today, but following up, we have Tapani, who is talking about a case study involving robo-debt, and I think that illustrates this point really well. The fourth condition is insufficient fit-for-purpose regulation. So despite the increased creation of these AI systems, the regulation takes a lot longer to create and it can be lagging behind. We do have some movements toward targeted regulation happening in the European Union and the United States. But in our survey, 41% of people were unconvinced that the government adequately regulates AI. And you can see that in red. And that's in contrast to the green, where we have only 29% of people agreeing that the government adequately regulates AI. And it isn't just the general public. In a recent survey of technology employees, the majority of them agreed that the government should regulate AI. And in a separate question, they felt that the tech industry is too powerful. The final condition that I want to talk about is the gap between trustworthy AI principles and what may be happening on the ground in practice. And there have been a proliferation over the last few years and the creation of ethical AI frameworks, trustworthy AI frameworks. Really, in the past few years, there's been a lot. I think at this point there are over 100. There's been some consensus around a smaller set of principles. Here are the 7 trustworthy AI principles that have been put forward by the European Commission. And you can see that they contain things like human agency and oversight, and transparency and accountability. And we know that the majority of people support these and expect these to be in place. And so from our survey, for example, we know that about 95% of people across the 5 countries feel that these trustworthy principles are really important for trust in AI, and that their associated practices, how do you implement these principles, are important in trusting in AI. But the problem is that it's been identified that sometimes there is a gap between these trustworthy AI principles or ethics frameworks and what's happening on the ground in practice, at least some of the time. And this is a really big problem because when you have the existence of these ethical AI frameworks, it can give the impression that everything is being managed by these AI frameworks. The risks are being managed, the challenges are being managed. When in reality, this may not always be the case. And this is in part because these frameworks tend to be voluntary and the language in them is really aspirational and vague, and so they can be difficult to operationalize and implement. And from our survey, though, we know that people have indicated that there are several things that organizations can begin to do, can start to do now, which include things, these things would increase public trust. And these are things like AI ethics boards and organizational AI codes of conduct. So in summary, takeaways, 3 of the key things that we can do to enhance trust in AI. Firstly, we can increase awareness and understanding about AI. And we can extend this to the general public, but also, as been mentioned, employees and consumers, and really give people that power to engage in public policy and debate and really understand what's happening with AI. As a starting point, our surveys identified several technology where there seems to be a gap between how people are using it and whether or not they're aware of that, especially social media. And these could benefit from targeted education resources. Secondly, we can engage with regulators to strengthen the regulatory framework to govern AI. And we can also communicate that back to the public and let them know about the governance of AI. And finally, we can live up to the public expectations around how AI should be implemented using these trustworthy principles and practices. And so this is where organizations can and should step up and play a key role and a proactive role. And I think that really links to what Gabby Walters brought up earlier about these unanticipated results and unanticipated consequences, and trying to work to make them anticipated consequences, work toward thinking about these guidelines and implementing the trustworthy practices to support trustworthy AI development. And this is especially important as the legislation catches up. And before I finish, I just want to highlight this report that we published with KPMG. It's called Achieving Trustworthy AI. And it sets out a practical model for organizations as they're thinking about implementing trustworthy AI principles and frameworks, how to connect this through an organization, and how to meet the public's expectations. And this report is freely available on our UQ website and the KPMG website. And I will stop there. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and express my appreciation for their valuable contributions to our society. So, very much connecting to the previous talks we've had from David and Caitlin, we saw from David what you're supposed to do as an organization and a manager with managing the AI systems to get it right. And this, I'm going to talk to you about an example of what happens when none of these things are being done. So this is a research project that we've been conducting for a while and publishing on it, and Ida Some and Nicole Gillespie, who are here as well today, are part of this project as valuable contributors. So basically, when talking about using AI or algorithms in public services, a lot of governments all around the world are turning to what we call algorithmic decision-making systems to improve the delivery of various public services. So making decisions on who gets social security benefits and how much, who gets maternity leave, how much, who gets retirement benefits, which patients should hospitals, emergency wards prioritize, and so on. Various decisions that are affecting humans. And these ADM systems come with many benefits in terms of efficiency, cost reductions, removing human biases, making more decision-making more neutral and objective. But due to their unique nature, they are also very risky to implement, as David already talked about. So basically, the decisions and predictions are based on historical data, and that data typically contains societal biases that are then reproduced by algorithms. And this is done very rapidly. So compared to humans, algorithms operate on very fast speeds. And if there will be damage, it'll also be, if something goes wrong, it'll go wrong on a massive scale, because typically these decisions are affecting thousands or hundreds of thousands of people simultaneously. The systems can be inscrutable in the sense that the people who are affected by the decisions are rarely aware of the logic or workings of the system's decisions that are affecting them. And this is especially the case with deep learning models, more complex AI models that even the system developers may not understand. And then typically these systems are implemented as autonomous replacements of humans, although this is not something you should do. David talked about augmentation, but it's very tempting to do so if you have the opportunity, because that reduces costs. So because of all of this, ADM systems can be dangerous. And as a kind of a comparison, you can think of knife versus machine gun. So there's only so much damage that a single human worker working manually can cause, but ADM system scales up the extent of damage as well. So if you manage these systems poorly, they can cause lasting negative impact on society very quickly. And there are concerns of digital dystopia that we're working towards by using these systems, because typically, often these systems have been found to punish those in society who are already disadvantaged. So basically, causing a bias and injustice in society to aggravate from whatever it is already. And a case example of this is really Australian government's Robodebt program that was implemented in 2016 to automatically detect and collect welfare overpayments. So if some welfare recipients have received too much money. And the algorithm was comparing their Centrelink records of how much welfare support they have received with their income data from Australian Taxation Office, and then automatically dispatching invoices or debt letters to those citizens. And the problem here was that these two data sources were incompatible, so the algorithm was implementing simple averaging calculation to smooth out the difference, and that turned out to be often incorrect. And as we all know from the news, it ended up in a disaster. The government had to apologize, they had to withdraw the system, and they had to do an expensive settlement to compensate the victims. And the question we were asking, how does something like this happen in a society? We took a systemic perspective on the issue, and there you're typically looking at some sort of socio-technical system in an organization that has a transformation process. Here we are talking about altered or changed debt identification and collection process within Centrelink, and that produces some sort of outputs. Here they are the debt letters sent to people and the implications of that. And typically these outputs should inform the transformation process and whatever inputs, strategic inputs that initiated them, and then have a sort of self-correcting mechanism in place. So when we look at the kind of a strategic direction or an ideological underpinnings that gave birth to this program, we can see that it was very much financially, economically focused program. So it was politically motivated in that there were campaign promises made by the to-be-elected government where they promised significant cost savings, and also doing this by welfare fraud crackdown. So it was very much centered around financial objectives without much consideration of stakeholders. Again, a point that Caitlin mentioned. And when you start a program with this kind of ideology, it then naturally resulted in replacing previously very human-centric work with algorithms. So in David's pyramid, algorithm was put firmly on top, humans were in the bottom. The humans who were previously doing very careful casework, gathering evidence on citizens, contacting their employers, contacting the citizens, working out these things together, all of this was scrapped, and the algorithm would do everything automatically by using simple averaging. And there was also this presumption of guilt in a way, so that invoices were sent to customers, to citizens, and they would have to prove that they do not owe any debt if they didn't want to pay for it. And the work of Centrelink workers was kind of limited, their agency was limited into more of a mechanic processing and following orders away from independent thinking. And what really happened, of course, a lot of these outputs, these debt notifications were incorrect, and that caused significant financial, social, and psychological distress to thousands of people who were affected by them. And this led to depression, anxiety, economic struggles, and in many cases, unfortunately, also in suicides. So here you might reasonably ask, how about a corrective feedback loop? If you think of that even during the development and deployment of the systems, there were a lot of red flags raised, a lot of critical voices. People in Centrelink were telling, like, this is not going to work, this is, it'll be incorrect. The legal experts saying that reversing the onus of proof is not lawful, and so on, yet this did not cause the decision makers to reconsider their strategy on the matter. And you might also wonder whether there was a feedback loop from when the negative effects on society, significant negative effects were surfacing, that these would then inform the design of the overall work system. And also this did not happen. There were minor modifications throughout the 3 years that the system was operational, but during those 3 years the government kept defending the system, and they also did not fix the major problem of the system, which was the onus of proof, for instance. What they did see, however, that the system was generating revenue for them. So there was a strong positive feedback loop in terms of money recouping. So everything in the system, in the process redesign, starting from the algorithm to the people's employees, new roles or agencies, and processes was geared, in a way, geared towards intimidating people to not ask questions, but just to trust the robot, trust the algorithm, and pay their debts. And this is what happened. A lot of people were intimidated into paying their debts, their purported debts. So there was a clear, significant revenue flow to the government, which kind of reinforced their commitment to the system. Although there were negative feedback signals, but considering the original strategy and ideology behind the whole program, this was causing inertia in a way that they were only seeing the positive effects that they wanted to see from this system. So basically what we're seeing here is a path dependency. And this is something that we see in IT implementations across contexts in different organizations. Every IT implementation is strategically and politically motivated in some way. There are certain underpinnings in any IT implementation, and they set path dependencies that, in some cases, especially in this one, cause the system to get a life of its own. It becomes something emergent, and it kind of leaves outside of people's control, although, of course, there were many decision makers who could have pulled the plug had they wanted so. But this really highlights the importance of assessing the long-term implications of seemingly innocent implementation decisions. And this is a real, like, an ongoing managerial challenge, because typically in the hurdle of implementing systems, people are looking at the short-term implications instead of considering the long-term ones. And these underpinnings, these path dependencies, cause often managers to heed to some feedback loops while ignoring others, which happened in this case as well. And this depends on what kind of ideology imperatives are behind the implementation. So really, again, do not overcommit to a system, avoid escalation of commitment, and also one should be sensitive to all relevant feedback information when the system has been deployed as well. So eventually, of course, the system was discredited, but there was a slow response because we are clearly lacking these legal and other infrastructures for challenging government agencies and their algorithm misuse. So there were a lot of whistleblowers who were trying to voice out concerns, but they were dismissed, silenced, fired from Centrelink. Public critics were targeted, so there was a blogger, Andy Fox, who was criticizing her private information was leaked by Centrelink. There was Professor Terry Carney, who was publishing papers on the legal problems of the scenario. He was also dismissed from the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. In general, the government agencies that were scrutinizing this, including the Ombudsman, were not rigorous or diligent enough in their assessments. And the community legal aid centers were under severe burden and lacking capacity. Ultimately, a complex constellation of societal agents, individual activists, academics, and legal centers were able to challenge the scheme and finally bring it to its end and force the government to retire it. So basically, what we're seeing here, we need more. Clearly, we need more of these kind of infrastructures, and Australia has artificial intelligence ethics frameworks, but it's very voluntary, it's more of an aspirational. Probably something more enforcing could help, like GDPR in Europe. And of course, this was not a complex AI system, but whatever happened here, the learnings are very much applicable to any AI system as well. Government decision makers, there should be probably a way to make things accountable. Like here, one would assume that government decision makers would hold themselves accountable if they make mistakes or wrong decisions. Here, that has not really happened, so a societal challenge here is how to do this, because accountability becomes more challenging when you have algorithms involved. Probably better protections for whistleblowers are needed. There has been critique that in Australia they are not strong enough. Probably they are not strong enough in other countries either. And community legal centers, we saw that they are clearly underfunded because their role was instrumental in challenging robo-debt, and probably they need more resources. And similarly goes to the AAT. And unfortunately, cases like these stifle the technology adoption by governments. So there was also another AI project that was being developed during the time of robo-debt that would have had a similar purpose of identifying debtors, but this was more of an human augmentation type of approach. Unfortunately, the developers pulled the plug on it due to the reputational problems caused by robo-debt. That's all from me today. Thank you very much for listening.
Hello. Do I need to press something, or is it just going to come up? Okay. Hello, hi, I'm Martin Edwards from the Business School, and thanks for Caitlin and Tapani for your presentations. I'm going to take a little bit more of a focused approach in terms of what I'm looking at, in terms of research, some of the research that I've been involved in, and going to be focusing on digital HR systems being introduced in effect, and looking at monitoring and metric systems and the impact and challenges that these monitoring and metric systems have in the workplace. So this is a kind of early stage research project that we've been working on a much bigger project going forward. And we're focusing on this topic because of the growing use of digital tools that monitor and metricize employee activities in the workplace. And we've seen an increased use of these kind of technologies with digital HR systems that automatically collect data and present metrics for performance management purposes. And we've also seen an increase in the use of pulse and vibe surveys introduced into HR systems that collect real-time people feedback metrics. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And so this project's kind of looking at this increasing use of these kind of systems in the workplace. So just as an example, some of these deep digital HR metric systems, there's a whole range of different software providers that are providing these performance metric systems associated with employees, IntelliHR, Vibe, Peakon, and there's a whole range of them. And some of these systems are being set up to, in effect, set out, monitor and measure employee performance on a whole range of different metrics, and ultimately present dashboards on how employees are performing in the workplace. And these dashboards are often collecting information and presenting information on employees on a very regular basis, for example, on a monthly or a quarterly basis, so that managers can assess how employees are doing on a range of different competencies, metrics, and different types of performance outcomes. And employees also can see how they're performing as well on these metrics. And there's a whole array of different software providers that are looking at these or presenting different types of employee performance metrics and different dashboards so that employees are getting real-time actionable insights from these kind of performance metric systems. And some of these performance metric systems are collecting data and presenting data associated to employee performance on a very regular basis, for example, on a daily basis. And the systems can also enable things like employees giving feedback constantly on how their fellow co-workers are doing on particular apps, rating each other in terms of how much of a team player you are, Steve, today, et cetera, and these systems can basically give you constant real-time feedback on how you're doing, Steve. There you go. So I've just put that up there because Workday, a big human resource information system, has recently bought one of these systems. The idea to integrate that into their human resource information system so that these employee survey type feedback mechanisms can become a core part of and a natural part of what organizations do in terms of feeding back on employees. But the suggestion with these systems is that they provide real-time, actionable, insightful, and employee feedback, which benefits the employees, increases their performance, increases their motivation, and obviously managers can also get a sense on how employees are doing. Aside from these HR information systems, there are also obviously key operating systems now that are providing metrics on how employees are performing. So for example, the Microsoft 365 productivity score takes account of what everybody's doing on their Microsoft suite and can produce a suite of performance data associated with different metrics, for example, how well they're communicating with their colleagues, how quickly they respond to emails, their kind of meeting activities, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, these systems can provide a considerable amount of information across a range of different metrics that can be considered to be very important performance management metrics, if you like, in the workplace. For example, how long has somebody been active on the system? When's the last time they weren't active? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So why might these systems be a good thing? So just looking at the positive side for this and why these systems might be considered as being important. Well, they provide feedback, potentially motivate employees, and direct performance of our employees. So if we look at goal-setting theory, if we have a range of metrics and performance metrics that we're presented with, this may motivate us and direct our efforts in the workplace. And also, if we know that we're doing well across a range of different performance metrics, this will give us positive feedback, and that'll be important for us in terms of giving us job satisfaction and motivation. From an HR perspective, having a whole suite of automated performance appraisal metrics presented on a dashboard can be very useful in a performance appraisal, where the line manager can sit down there and they have a whole array of different performance metrics presented to them when they're having the appraisal or giving the appraisal. Organizations can also align strategic aims with particular metrics that the organization deems important that employees should try to achieve. And also, these metrics can also be very helpful for an organization in presenting standardized performance metrics that people's performance achievements can be recorded against these metrics in a standardized way, in an objective way, that don't involve some kind of subjective rating by the an employee supervisor. But key is that this real-time, actionable, insightful employee feedback will be positive for the organization. But of course, there are potential challenges to these systems. Fairness is particularly important. If these systems are used, and the more that organizations use these systems, these metrics need to accurately represent employee performance and be a reasonable, reliable, and valid indicator of how somebody is doing in their job. Also, these systems, especially as they become more automated and integrated into digital HR systems, monitoring is required, and that raises big privacy and trust issues, which is particularly important in terms of setting the, if you like, the employment experience that employees work within. There's a danger with that the more these systems are being used, that employees may get feedback overload, and potentially that could lead to burnout and they switch off. Questions around what kind of motivation is being triggered. Are people just in these systems just going to be focusing on trying to achieve the metrics without necessarily internalizing the goals that have been set for them by their organization? Also, there may be a range of unintended consequences which the organization may not have planned for when introducing these systems. For example, people might just be chasing the metrics and ignoring the purpose of these metrics in the background. So this piece of research, we're looking at whether or not monitoring and metric systems have a positive impact on employee outcomes or a negative impact on employee outcomes. So that's the key thing that we're kind of looking at here. We carried out a pilot study where we collected 3 waves of data on employees who were working full-time, and they had to specify, and they were only included if they worked in jobs where their performance was recorded against performance metrics. There's a whole range of jobs that people were doing in the survey: consultants, solicitors, IT directors, etc., etc. And when we asked what kind of metrics they were being rated against, there was a whole range of different types of metrics that they were presented, so I'm just presenting some of those here. So the key thing that we were interested in is whether these monitoring and metric systems are having a positive or negative impact on employee outcomes, and from an employee outcome perspective, we were focusing on engagement and intention to quit or intention to stay within the organization as key outcomes. And in terms of what we were looking at in terms of employee metrics, the metric systems, we broke it down to a number of key features, one of which was how frequent these metrics were being taken, how frequently were people being measured, and how frequently were the data being presented to employees. The coverage of these metrics, what proportion of their job, for example, is covered by these metrics, and also the number of metrics associated with a person, how many different metrics are being taken on each employee. So the idea is we were trying to identify whether these particular system features might be particularly important in leading to a positive or negative outcome. If they are going to lead to a positive or negative outcome, however, there's likely to be a mechanism that's at play that's going to be leading to a positive or negative outcome in terms of engagement. And one of the key positive mechanisms we focused on to try to measure was metric-oriented behavior. People were, and we can, just an example of what we mean by this, it's whether employees pay particular attention to tasks if they're likely to boost how they are evaluated in a performance metric. So people are actually doing what they're expected to do and trying to achieve those tasks. So that is one particular mechanism that we expect to be following on after the introduction of these performance metric systems. And the idea is that this metric-oriented behavior could be a mechanism that can then lead on to high levels of engagement or lower levels of intention to quit, for example. But also, we suggest that there's likely to be a negative outcome of these kind of systems, and we refer to this as metric orientation behavior overload, where people over-focus on trying to achieve particular metrics, potentially at the cost of neglecting other obligations associated with their jobs that they really should be doing if they can be considered to be doing a good job. So we refer to this as metric-orientated behavior overload. So that's the kind of negative side of what we're looking at here. But key, because the more the organizations are using this system, these systems, we would suggest that the fairness and the validity of these metrics need to be important for these systems to work, one of the things that we also looked at was the degree to which employees felt that these particular measures and metrics were generally considered to be a good, reliable, or valid measure of their performance in their job, and we would argue that that's going to be a particularly important feature that would determine whether or not these systems are likely to have a positive or negative outcome. So this is our model. We did some analysis, lots of lines and numbers. I'm not going to go through that in detail. I don't have the time. So I'll summarize the findings in a few words. Okay. So what we found was the more intense, the more frequent the metric utilization was used by organizations, and the greater the level of coverage of these metric systems in terms of how much people's jobs were covered by the metrics, then the more this triggered a positive response in terms of metric-oriented behavior, and also the more it triggered a negative response in terms of metric-oriented behavior overload. But we also found that where metric-oriented behavior was triggered, this was associated with higher levels of engagement and lower levels of intent to quit. But where people were focusing too much on trying to achieve these metrics, this was associated with lower levels of engagement and higher levels of intent to quit. There was some evidence, which was quite interesting, that the greater the number of the metrics that were used in these systems, this potentially reduced metric-orientated behavior overload. And the argument here is that may spread people's focus a bit more around different parts of their job so that they're not mono-focusing on a particular target. However, the metrics must be highly valid to avoid metric-orientated behavior overload. If the metrics have low reliability and the validity of the metrics are low, in other words, employees perceive these metrics to be poor indications of their proper employee performance, then the more frequent measurement will increase the likelihood of metric-oriented behavior overload and subsequent negative outcomes, as in low engagement and high intent to quit. And also, where these metrics have low reliability and validity, then the greater number of metrics will not reduce metric-orientated behavior overload, which is something which is quite interesting in terms of the findings that we found. So just in terms of lessons for business, introducing these metric systems, the monitoring of employees and presenting dashboards of performance metrics of these types, basically there's a delicate balance for organizations to play. Yes, there's evidence of a positive outcome of some of these systems, potentially in terms of increasing motivation, but there's also clear evidence of some negative outcomes as well. These are equally likely, and they could equally lead to disengagement and more likelihood of people wanting to leave the organization. But there's potentially a deadly HR combination of implementation of these systems where if these metrics are used heavily, these systems are used heavily and applied heavily, but they're not necessarily considered to be valid or reliable measures of people's performance, then this is more likely to lead to metric-oriented behavior overload, lower engagement, and higher intent to leave. So there's a challenge when these centralized HR systems are applied to the workplace with little care, and organizations need to take a lot of care, taking off-the-shelf systems and monitoring and presenting metrics for employees on a constant, real-time approach. And so there's real care that needs to be taken in with the use of these kind of systems. So there we go. That's me done.
Thanks, Caitlin and Tapani and Martin, for 3 fantastic presentations. A lot to think about. I'm conscious of time, so Rob, if you wouldn't mind coming up and synthesizing your thoughts on the 3 presentations. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you again for the opportunity to discuss these 3 fascinating presentations and the opportunity to be here today. I'll try to be brief and conscious of time. So thinking about these three presentations and thinking about my own sort of limited expertise in these areas, I thought that the best thing I could focus on is the relationship between regulation and trust. So my background is in legal theory, and even when I look at issues around automation of legal reasoning, I tend to take a more theoretical perspective. But most legal theorists are familiar with discussing this idea of the rule of law or the principle of legality, and the idea that we should have regulation that is stable, clear, publicly available, applied equally, if it's appropriate or in the appropriate circumstances, justified to people, and so on. And in my own work, I've looked at the so-called right to explanation as an instance of the principle of legality with respect to automation decision-making. So one thing that I think came across in all three presentations is this tension between regulation and trust. So on the one hand, you might think that regulation or legal intervention of a general sort is inimical to trust, but on the other hand, there's a sense in which it promotes trust. So in contract law, which is my bread and butter as a lecturer, we talk about this tension a lot because you can imagine the dialogue between two contracting parties, one of whom wants a handshake agreement, the other of whom says, no, I want it in writing. And both of them can say, in a sense, why don't you trust me? The person who wants it in writing can say, if you trusted me, you'd put it in writing, and the person who doesn't can say, well, if you trusted me, you'd leave it as a so-called gentleman's agreement. So legal intervention interferes with our interpersonal relationships, but it can also promote trust within them. And I think in the automation context, you have two kinds of relationship that you need to promote trust within. You've got the relationship between government and its subjects, and then you also have the relationship between so what you might call intimate relationships or private relationships, including the employer-employee relationship, which I certainly wouldn't want to say was intimate, but it occurs typically away from the state. And so if you're trying to promote trust within those relationships, what I want to say is that some degree of regulation, if it's well crafted, can actually encourage or promote trust. And Tapani mentioned with his discussion of robo-debt, which was fascinating, the so-called GDPR in Europe, the General Data Protection Regulations, which take steps to make sure that people's corporations and government's use of data is open, transparent, explainable or justified to its citizens. All of that, I think, would be a good idea in the Australian context. I understand there are different reports and reviews with different government organs. There's multiple of them at the moment taking place with respect to what kind of regulatory environment we should adopt in Australia. So I think I couldn't possibly do justice to the three talks that were broad and diverse, but one issue that came up in all three, in Caitlin's, Tapani's, and in a different way, I think, in Martin's, was this issue of the extent to which regulation or self-regulation can promote trust, and I thought that was something that was worth thinking more about and would be a fitting point with which to start discussion.
Thanks very much, Rob. And yeah, I'm conscious of time. So do we have any questions from the online audience, Shannon? No, none at all. Okay, questions from the room.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Elizabeth Jameson here. I found it a fascinating morning, to be honest. Just on this point about regulation, I'm very interested in all of the panelists' views about who and how you regulate, who does the regulating and how you do it, because regulators are created by and regulations are created by Parliament, and Robodebt says Parliament doesn't get this either. So can you talk to us a little bit more about, you know, those couple of good examples of, you know, I guess the Tapani in the European instance? How do you regulate something that we're all struggling with as much, whether Parliament, business, industry, commerce, and corporates?
Yeah, it's a very good point and a real challenge. So I think one example from the European context would come to this from this right to explanation. So for instance, one of the key problems with Robodebt was that the debt letters, especially in the beginning, they did not have any kind of explanations for, you know, how this debt has been calculated, where does it come from, and in the GDPR context, this would have been basically illegal. So this would not have been possible. You would have, and when citizens were calling Centrelink and asking about it, also the people at Centrelink were not allowed to disclose, and sometimes they wouldn't even know how this was calculated. So, for instance, this aspect of it would be addressed with this right to explanation. And there are also I think there are also regulations in the GDPR about the autonomous decision making, and there are certain limits that are put on that. But when it comes to the actual, how do you regulate the decision makers who are actually doing these things, and that's a very vexing problem in the sense that in Netherlands there was a similar case, so very similar type of social service, like benefit recollection, automation, and there that actually led to similar scandal, and there the government resigned as a result. So it was kind of surprising, but here it did not happen. No heads have actually been rolling, and that would require, because you know it's the top officials who are in charge. So how do you actually regulate them? And I'm not sure if I have a good answer to that. Probably needs some sort of a precedent from a royal commission or some other mechanism.
Yeah, I would agree with what you've said, and also interested in what's happening and being proposed in Europe, kind of thinking about deploying organizations, conducting some sort of impact assessments and before these things are deployed. And I think that touches on something that we haven't really talked about yet, which is that I would hope that the regulation would also take into account that it's not sort of a set and forget, but it also has to have a continuous monitoring component as these things are rolled out. And then just one more point, kind of extending on the conversation this morning, that we would also hope that it isn't just about the regulation, but that organizations and people deploying these systems are going beyond that and exceeding the bar rather than just aiming for the minimum.
Yeah, I mean, your question is quite an interesting question in the context of an election coming up, in terms of the government may not necessarily have the competency to be able to regulate. I think that's a key point you're making. That shouldn't stop them trying, I don't think. I mean, in Europe with the GDPR, across, you know, that basically is an amalgamation of many countries' privacy legislation that they decided to bring in and make standard across Europe, and they've done I would say they've done a pretty good job of it. And so Australia can also have a go at it. But there seems to be a bit of a value system difference in Australia versus Europe. Whether they want to try and regulate it is another issue. I mean, there are some interesting features of the Australian legislation associated with privacy. For example, the employee exemption associated with private sector organizations can basically do what they want with employee data. And that seems to show a certain value system that might be stopping them wanting to regulate various aspects associated with data. I mean, that's different from AI, but obviously the GDPR does cover aspects of AI as well, and there's no reason why Australia can't try and do it. But it doesn't mean that Europe or I say Europe, doesn't necessarily get it right all the time. I say Europe because the UK had some issues with their AI when they were trying to decide what to do with predicting who was going to get what grades before COVID, when people didn't do the exams, and then they basically applied AI to try to get predictive values associated with what grades people were going to get and whether they go to university or not. But they've pretty much got some of that wrong as well. So just because the GDPR potentially was in existence in the UK, that doesn't mean that they're going to get it, that they're not going to have some of these problems anyway. But yeah, I mean, it seems to me that there may be a competency issue, and obviously the world is changing and AI is changing. It has to be constantly developed, but Australia can also have a go at it as well, I think. And I think they are, and there are various things they're trying to do, and hopefully they'll be successful going forward. So,
And
that's my view.
just responding to what you said and thinking of it further, there was strong support in our public attitude survey, responding to this idea of competencies, of who would be competent to put forward this regulation. In our survey, there was really strong support for the idea of an independent AI regulator, and I know that that has been suggested as well by the Committee for the Economic Development of Australia. So that is one avenue that could be pursued, whether this would be someone with specialized expertise that would sort of oversee this area.
Shannon, do we have time for one more question, or do we want lunch? Want lunch, everyone?
I think everyone looks hungry.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks again to our presenters and our discussant for a wonderful session. Thank you very much, and enjoy lunch.